Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Richard Fleming. I'm a physicist, nuclear cardiologist, and attorney from the United States of America. I would like to thank the plenipotentiary of the Slovakian government of the COVID-19 pandemic for the invitation to appear here and for the ability to be here virtually given the security concerns that currently exist. For this presentation, I'm going to enlarge the screen so that you can focus on the slides that will be presented during this talk, so to give you the best view of the information. I will also be providing you with copies of two books. One is COVID-19, a bioweapon, a scientific and forensic investigation. And the second, Are We the Next Endangered Species? Bioweapons, Eugenics, and More. These two documents, these two books, which will come to you as PDFs for inclusion in the record, will provide the information underlying much of what's said in these slides that I'm presenting to you this morning, as well as provide more substantial information that I think you and your government will find very useful. The second book really emphasizes that we need to differentiate between the actual biological weapons or the viruses that have been produced versus the eugenic genetic vaccines that, while they are problematic, are a consequence of the actual bioweapon that we know as SARS-CoV-2, or frequently referred to as COVID-19. In 1776, on the 4th of July, the founding fathers of the United States of America declared war on England. It sought to be free and independent. Following that declaration of war, the founding fathers sat down to draft the Articles of Confederation, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here. They were created in mid-November of 77, ratified the following February, and effective on the 1st of March, 1781. However, these documents were not very successful, as they did not give enough authority to General George Washington to mobilize troops from one area of the country to the next in an effort to deal with British forces on American sovereign soil. In mid-September of 1787, the founding fathers realized they could not work with the Articles of Confederation, and they needed something that was more totalitarian, a federalist document. And that document is the United States Constitution. It granted all the power to the federal government, removing any control from the states or the people. And the founding fathers realized that while this might be necessary to allow General Washington to mobilize troops in a country that was not yet organized or willing to share, they also realized that this posed a grave threat to any sovereign nation, and they included within it amendment clauses. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see that the founding fathers came back on the 25th of September, 1789, and assembled amendments to the Constitution, withdrawing power from the federal government and restoring it back to the people and to the states. This is known as the Bill of Rights. And every amendment added to the U.S. Constitution is a further attempt to remind the federal government of the United States that the power belongs to the people and to the states, and not to a federalistic totalitarian government. The principle being driven home that is important not only for the development of the United States of America, but for every sovereign nation at this point in time that the World Health Organization, the international health regulations are attempting to control and usurp national sovereignty, the principle is to not, under any set of circumstances, give total authoritarian power to any one group of people, or you will soon find yourself as a non-free people, just as the United States was in the beginning, which had to be rectified to prevent the disaster that would have befallen the United States had we not gone in and amended the U.S. Constitution. The The use of biological weapons is not new, and it has existed for thousands of years. And you can see to the left that the Hittites and the Romans and the Mongols were using it quite extensively. And by the time the United States was a country, smallpox was the weapon of choice. But by 1975, following the atrocities of the Second World War, world governments came together and decided that it was too dangerous to develop biological weapons, that unlike other weapons that kill where they land, biological weapons not only kill, but they maim and they spread. So in 1975, the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty was signed by a number of nations, including the United States and Russia. You can see a copy of it here, and the circled red areas emphasize certain components, which is nations that sign this document won't build biological weapons, won't store biological weapons. We won't use biological weapons. If we find them, we will not keep them. We will destroy them because they are too dangerous for anybody or any nation. In 1989, the Congress of the United States passed a legislation known as the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act for the expressed purpose of pointing out that the United States was going to have federal laws that address the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty and said we will not build weapons of this sort, that it is criminal to do so. We knew in the 1990s, as you can see here on the left-hand side of this, by March of 1998, that Russia, the Soviet Union, was building biological weapons. And yet, despite that, the United States, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, interfered with the ability to verify whether people were following the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty. By 1991, Ukraine and other previously controlled Russian states became independent. And as this document actually shows, by November of 2020 and 2021, November 25th, 2021, the United States filed a document with the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty to prove that we were following the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty. However, beginning in 1997, the United States Department of Defense, using the Biological Threat Reduction Program, went into several countries, including the Ukraine, immediately to your east, sitting between you and Russia. And within the Ukraine and these other nation states, the United States Department of Defense went in and secured these dangerous pathogens, even though Article 2 of the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty states quite explicitly that we would destroy those weapons. Instead, we secured and consolidated them. This document and table shows that the United States Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, our National Science Foundation, USAID, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, Agriculture, and the Interior have collectively spent more than $61 million on gain-of-function research grants that was provided through various organizations, including Peter Daszak at EcoHealth, Professor Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, Professor Shizheng Li at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the players of the agencies in the United States, including Drs. Fauci and Collins, were involved in the funding of these weapons. In fact, as you see at the very bottom, there was a policy advisor by the name of David Franz, who was a former commander at Fort Detrick, who became actively involved in EcoHealth Alliance's policy decisions on these gain-of-function biological weapons. I'm going to walk you through a history of approximately 2 decades going back to 1999, showing the involvement of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services funding research on coronaviruses. And by 2000, Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina had synthetically cloned a virus known as SARS-CoV-2. In 2001, Dr. Barrick obtained a patent. He submitted the patent, which he obtained in 2003, and that patent was for the express purpose of altering viruses and other living organisms genetically, which would allow him to make them more infectious and more dangerous. In 2002, this Barrick's patent is shown here. It's referred to as a chimer, which is combining different viruses or organisms, and there's the NIH grant funding. Dr. Shizheng Li, that same year in 2002, combined HIV pseudovirus with the original SARS-CoV-2 of 2002-2003, making it more infective. The following year in 2003, the data shows that Dr. Barrick was synthetically altering coronaviruses or coronaviridae. And you can see the National Institutes of Agencies grant that allowed this to happen. By 2006, Chinese researchers announced that they had assembled multiple components of viruses to a new virus that included hepatitis C virus, HIV, SARS-CoV-1, and SARS-CoV-2. So they identified in 2006 SARS-CoV-2. In 2007, the United States received its patent for the furin cleavage site. And this is important because we know that the SARS-CoV-2 virus has the unique property of having a furin site, a set of 4 amino acids that once cleaved facilitates the infectivity of this virus into human cells. This is an active patent. It will be until 2027. And if anybody other than the United States was using this patent, the United States most definitely would have taken them to patent court. It's also noted that in 2007, the National Science Foundation documented research that showed that should there be a concern about a pandemic, the first critical step would be stopping all international travel. That was not followed, despite the fact that this research was available to the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Disease to make decisions on. Former President Trump did, in fact, call for a cessation of travel in the absence of the advice that was to the contrary by Dr. Fauci. In 2007, Professor Barrick at the University of North Carolina cloned several viruses, including manipulating those viruses in what was the equivalent of gain of function at that time, which was pushing the virus through animal models until it would mutate. The virus in particular that you see funded by these NIH and NIAID grants is SARS-CoV-2. It is something that's very important in this discussion because the PCR matches from SARS-CoV-2 also matches SARS-CoV-2. And specifically, CoV-RS-SHC014, as you can see in the red print here. By 2011, gain-of-function research, including H5N1 influenza A bird flu virus, produced a problem with research at the University of Wisconsin and Netherlands labs having a leak in the gain-of-function infective virus that they had made and produced. This presentation is Dr. Fauci's discussion on gain-of-function, and I play it only to clarify the continued change in dynamics of Dr. Fauci's response as he keeps trying to redefine gain-of-function.
Integral to that study has always been the issue of gain-of-function research, not only for influenza, but essentially for all infectious diseases research. Now, there are a few ways to look at gain of function research. There's the naturally occurring mutations, which naturally give gain of function, and investigators study these effects on the phenotypes of interest. Does this mutation make something more transmissible, more pathogenic, or adapt to host better? Or what historically investigators have done is to actually create gain of function by making mutations, passage adaptation, or other newer genetic techniques such as reverse genetics and genetic reassortment. When we do that, often some phenotypes appear and others disappear. For example, it is commonly seen that when you increase a transmissibility, you may see a decrease in pathogenesis, or vice versa. You may deliberately increase pathogenesis and see a decrease in transmissibility. But the bottom line is that gain and loss of function research is critical to understanding disease pathogenesis, antimicrobial resistance, and host responses, as well as to developing better techniques of surveillance, vaccines, and therapeutics. Specifically, to gain of function research on HPAI H5N1. What we're talking about now is
So as you can see, at least in December of 2012, Dr. Fauci had no confusion about gain of function or its use in the field that NIAID, Dr. Fauci, and other federal agencies from the United States was funding. By 2012, an additional law was passed to enhance the previously passed 1989 Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act. In the United States, this is known as 18 United States Code Section 175, and it prohibits the development of biological weapons. And it very specifically states in the second part that something is not a biological agent if it's left where it naturally occurs. However, it becomes a biological agent when it's taken out of that environment. For example, the bats and the coronaviruses from the caves in China. Once it's removed from those caves and brought into human laboratories, it becomes a biological agent. And in this case, once manipulated, a biological weapon. The section of 175A further goes on to instruct the need for the Department of Justice in the United States and the U.S. military, if necessary, to intervene in a situation involving biological weapon of mass destruction. In 2013, the Middle Eastern respiratory virus, also a coronavirus, was noted both in Saudi Arabia and South Korea. It was noted at that point in time that early treatment was critical. And Barrick and the Chinese scientists that he was working with in 2013 showed that they could take coronaviruses with a spike protein known as HKU4 that previously was unable to infect human cells, change those viruses, those spike proteins, so that they would infect human cells, a clear gain of function. The following year in 2014, in addition to the HIV, or rather the H5N1 influenza A flu that we saw accidentally released in 2011, the CDC accidentally exposed U.S. workers to anthrax, along with shipping of the deadly flu virus that I just mentioned. There was also the smallpox vial that NIH found on a counter, a laboratory counter, not under controlled circumstances, that caused great concern in the scientific community. So by 2014, pressure from the scientific community put pressure on the Obama administration to halt gain-of-function research. And this lasted from 2014 actually to 2017, with some residual effect limiting in 2018. As you can see here, it was the scientific community, not the President of the United States, President Obama. He simply responded to pressure that was being placed upon him by the scientific community to halt the gain-of-function research. This document, posted October 17, 2014, is the U.S. government efforts to control gain-of-function research. However, it excluded EcoHealth Alliance and Professor Ralph Barrick from being limited in their gain-of-function research. And in 2014, you can see here the patent, which was funded by U.S. tax dollars through the National Institutes of Health. The gain-of-function spike-altering patent to Professor Barrick designed to specifically change the spike protein of coronaviruses for gain-of-function. Again, NIH clearly funded gain-of-function research, and here is a patent that specifically shows they paid for the ability to change the spike proteins of coronaviruses, and they are also the government agent. The U.S. government owns the patent for the purine cleavage site, which sits on these altered spike proteins of SARS-CoV-2, or if you wish, COVID-19. By 2015, there was further work from Shizheng Li, again, altering these HKU4 spike proteins that previously could not infect humans so that they, in fact, would infect humans. And Barrick and Shizheng Li in 2015 announced they could make much dangerous, more deadly, and infective viruses than those with the HKU4 spike protein. And so in 2016, we see this paper frequently talked about, talking about taking the spike protein of one virus and attaching it to the backbone of another. But what you see very specifically here are 5 specific nucleoside bases, the building blocks of genetic code, 5 specific nucleoside bases that were also changed in these viruses, and they were critical to the infectivity of these SARS-CoV-2 viruses. In 2016, Daszak and Shizheng Li constructed a clone. This is part of what Fauci was talking about with gain of function. And they used a technique known as bacterial artificial chromosome. These specific coronaviruses that Daszak and Shizheng Li were altering and trying to reproduce also had the ability to interfere with the human immune system by inhibiting interferon through something known as open reading frame 10. By 2017, all efforts to control or limit gain of function had been lifted. And we continued forward with work by Daszak and Shizheng Li, where they altered gain of function chimerically, combining different parts together to make 2 viruses now capable of infecting people that hadn't been there before. And here you can see, again, this is partial component of this backbone spike protein concept using the previously described bacterial cloning methods from 2016, 3 slides earlier. And it wasn't just more infective, it was more lethal. And here we can see in April of 2018, Professor Barrick talking about this at a conference at the University of North Carolina.
So based on that data, I think it's clearly, number one, if you don't believe me, you can believe Bill Gates. He clearly thinks that 10 million people could easily be killed in the next decade or so from infectious diseases. So things like SARS disappeared after 2004, Ebola disappeared, Zika virus has almost disappeared. So are these viruses actually extinct, or are they just hiding? We've actually asked that question with SARS. These are, again, between 2002, 2004. These are the viruses associated with the expanding SARS epidemic. Most of them are gone. In fact, all of them are gone. We can't find these viruses anymore. But when you sequence bats, these are horseshoe bats, and this is a bat that wants to bite whoever's handling it. You find all sorts of SARS-like viruses. In fact, these are up to 97% identical to these epidemic strains that caused human disease. So are they, do they have pre-pandemic potential? So that's the question that we were interested in. And so what we did was this spike, like a protein gene right here, mediates species specificity. You can actually remove that spike gene from these epidemic strains and put in these bat spike genes in place of them. This was done by Vincentury and other people in the lab. And of the 5 that we dropped in, being almost identical to very, very different, 3 of these could actually replicate just fine and use human receptors for entry. If you took primary human airway epithelial cells, those are cells that are removed from the conducting airways from transplant recipients, the lung they gave up, not the lung they received. So they take on the architecture of the human lung. SARS loves to replicate in these little cells that have cilia sticking out of them, and these viruses grow in those cells as well as the epidemic strains. And you can do a variety of experiments to try to get an idea of their pre-pandemic potential. So they replicate in the right cells, and they replicate exceptionally well. If this mouse, the parental strain is virulent, and you drop these bat strain genes in, they attenuate virulence. That's good news. But if you take a mouse that has the human receptor in it instead of the mouse receptor, these viruses are lethal. So they clearly have the potential to cause lethal disease. If you take vaccines against SARS that work against SARS, they don't work against these variants that are sitting in the animal pools, zoonotic pools, and therapeutic antibodies that are present that work against SARS don't work as well against the more distant strains. So the answer is there's still lots of pre-epidemic viruses around.
So what Dr. Barrick just told you is that they had intentionally gone in, altered animals, and altered the coronaviruses to make something that could now infect people and were resistant to any vaccines or medications that currently existed. Most people have heard about Event 201, if they've heard about war game scenarios being played, talking about how the world would respond to a pandemic. And many people have heard about the nuclear threat initiative that was the accepted gain-of-function monkeypox virus that had been produced by a nefarious country. What most people have not heard about was the SPARS, S-P-A-R-S, war game scenario that occurred in 2017. The SPARS, the St. Paul, Minnesota pandemic acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus pathogen war game, was identical to the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic that many of us went through personally over the last 4 years. The focus of all 3 of these war games is to determine how people will react to a pandemic and what needs to be done to convince people to agree to a totalitarian control by the World Health Organization and the international health regulations. This is the goal. This is what is talked about in these war game scenarios. They are discussed in more details in the books if you want more information, but they are focused on what is necessary to get nations to surrender sovereignty to a centralized WHO IHR totalitarian control to allow them to determine what happens during a pandemic. In 2018, Shi Zhengli at the Wuhan Institute of Virology had posted much of her data on these coronavirus studies, and that Shanghai University then deleted that information from the website. By the summer of 2019, the brand new facility that had only been completed the year before in Wuhan, this bio-level safety level 4 laboratory, was requiring increased filtration, burning systems, and was concerned about computer hacking and the data file getting out. The area around the Wuhan lab and where the military games were being played became much more stressed, much more focused on disease being transmitted. It worried about temperatures, hand washing. People were being admitted to hospitals as a problem was occurring in the summer to early fall of 2019 that most people in the world had not heard about. However, the U.S. military had heard about it because 7 weeks before the Wuhan wet market scenario at the beginning of November of 2019, the United States military paid out $419,511 to Ukrainian labs through Metabiota and Black & Veatch to actually fund a report on COVID, a disease that was caused by a virus that no one would hear about for another 7 weeks. And it's important to note that these labs in the Ukraine were some of the issues that Russian Premier Putin has talked about having to do with their concern about the Ukraine. By the 4th of March 2022, 8 days after Russia invaded the Ukraine, it was known that there were 19 labs, 15 with 4 mobile ones, in the Ukraine, sponsored by the United States. And within a couple months, June 10th, 2022, we would now know that the U.S. Pentagon was running 46 biolabs in the Ukraine at a cost of roughly $224 million. By the 31st of December, the world would hear about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 viruses, but the report that was initially published by the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission report would be deleted from the internet. In March of 2020, the United States very clearly, during the 7th review of the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty, affirmed that, in fact, we agreed with all the limitations of these biological agents and that under no circumstances would it be tolerated that any country, which would include the United States, China, Russia, and others, from developing such biological weapons. In July of 2021, these are redacted emails that came to me where Fort Detrick was trying to recruit me as a physicist to work at Fort Detrick on infectious disease funded by the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Disease. 7 weeks later, the book would come out and all communications from Fort Detrick and those trying to recruit me stopped. Again, emphasizing the $61 million plus funded, with more than half of it by the US DoD. When we look at the PCR data, we can see that what we call SARS-CoV-2 matches extensively the 3 viruses CoV-RS-SHC014, which is also Barrett's Urbani virus that you saw earlier in this presentation. The PCR data also matches components of SARS-CoV-MA15 and CoV-RS-3367. All 3 of these viruses shown in both books were funded by U.S. taxpayers through the DoD, Health and Human Services, NIH, NIAID, all the agencies that you saw before. And within those books are the documented grants, the publications, the patents that show these viruses being built, and subsequently the evolution of SARS-CoV-2 from lab origin gain-of-function bioweapons. This is that map originally showing 4th March. You can see here these labs, the initial labs, the 15 plus 4, not even the complete number that we now know, sit just to the east of Slovakia. Raising the question, what if the people you're trusting are the people causing the problem? And the SPARS pandemic war game of 2017 is just one example showing that the people that are wanting control, the WHO, IHR, and these totalitarian groups wanting control, are also associated with running the war games to determine what it will take for you to surrender your sovereignty. The information in the 2 books is COVID-19 a bioweapon and Are We the Next Endangered Species? These PDFs come with this presentation for you to have to review, to understand, and to include in your government documents in Slovakia as you respond to all of this. The impact of the SARS-CoV-2 bioweapon has been dramatic. Devastating loss of millions of lives throughout the world, separations of family members who couldn't connect up, including ill family members, hospitalized family members, funerals in many instances, loss of personal liberties that were associated with these lockdowns that occurred around the world, the cumulative damage to the protective mechanisms that already existed, and the large experimentation, not only including mandates and masking and restrictions from travel, but also the experimental eugenic genetic vaccines, which there's more information provided in the second book, Are We the Next Endangered Species? And ultimately, as these war games show, an effort to pressure countries to surrender their sovereignty to the WHO and international health regulations that we have all recently been talking about. This is from Goering's trial in 1947, where he emphasized at trial that any country, independent upon what it thought its form of government was, whether it was fascist, communist, socialist, a republic, a democracy, a parliament, could get its people to do whatever they wanted if they simply said there was a problem, outlined what the answer to the problem was, and then emphasized that anybody who simply didn't go along with that answer posed a threat and should be dealt with appropriately. This is what the United States signed the following year. The World Health Organization Joint Resolution. Treaties and resolutions are relatively clear, but you can see here on the 14th of June, 1948, President Harry Truman signed it, and Congress ratified it, as shown by those signatures. And the circled area, Section 5, was very clear, because in signing this document, the United States stated, in adopting this joint resolution, the Congress does so with the understanding that nothing in the Constitution of the World Health Organization, in any manner, commits the United States to enact any specific legislative program regarding any matters referred to in said Constitution. In other words, despite signing this WHO joint resolution, what people frequently refer to as the treaty, the United States was making it very clearly known that we weren't going to enact any laws. We're happy to work with the WHO, but we're not controlled by the WHO, and we won't be. By 2005, the international health regulations showed the same response, as the United States had understandings and reservations. Again, those understandings and limitations basically said that anything that was passed in the IHR would not affect federal law in the United States, in that we would respond to the 10th Amendment, granting the states and the people within the states of the United States the right to decide what they would do, if anything, in response to the IHR. But efforts to chip away at that, have been ongoing, as many of us have noted in the most recent May through the beginning of June 2024, only a couple of weeks ago. These documents were presented in Geneva with an effort of pushing them through, of trying to coerce nations to surrender their sovereignty, to be controlled, as you can see here, by people that would be positioned in each country to respond to the World Health Organization and the international health regulations, to take orders from the WHO, bypassing the sovereignty of countries to make decisions for themselves. A synopsis of this material is that it's important to realize that Russia, the United States, and other governments have funded and developed biological weapons, despite agreeing by the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty and any applicable laws in the United States that we would not build such weapons. The U.S. has funded, as you've seen, more than 2 decades, including funds from our Department of Defense, National Institutes of Health, National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, the USAID, and other agencies, the development of biological agents that are by definition, by the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty, by the 1989 Anti-Terrorism Act, and the 2012 18 U.S.C. Section 175. By definition, these are bioweapons. The funding and publication documents are provided in these two books, so you have them for your government records and to respond to. The SARS-CoV-2 bioweapons resulted in millions of deaths and many more millions of injured individuals, of men, women, and children around the world. The World Health Organization, in and through the international health regulations, failed to alter the outcome of this biological weapons pandemic, and yet now they seek to centralize power under their control under the guise of improving outcomes in the event of a naturally occurring pandemic or another bioweapon attack. Having failed to alter the outcomes during these SARS-CoV-2 bioweapons, there is absolutely no reason to believe and no reason to surrender national sovereignty to an international power, including one that does not represent the sovereignty of our nations, but rather intersects with, it has the interests of those at the WHO and IHR interests as their focus. It will not result in a different outcome than the SARS-CoV-2 bioweapon pandemic. Therefore, there is no reason to grant such totalitarian power to the World Health Organization or the international health regulations. And given the relationship of those involved in the bioweapon pandemic, as well as the continued war game scenarios being played out by these agencies and individuals, it is critical to take a lesson from the pages of history, including the founding fathers of the United States of America, and not surrender national sovereignty of any nation to any totalitarian or federalist system. Accordingly, no nation, including Slovakia or the United States, should allow any centralized power to usurp our national sovereignties, particularly noting that the totalitarian power itself can produce the problem they seek to control, can define the solution that must be followed without question, and consider anyone who does not follow the defined solution to be viewed as a threat to the totalitarian system itself, and as such, must be removed as a threat. Accordingly, I call upon the Slovakian government to veto any changes in the currently proposed WHO IHR document agreements. I further call upon you to revoke any prior WHO IHR document agreements that limit Slovakian autonomy as a nation, to take back control to yourself, your country. I call upon all nation states to join and ask you to call upon all nation states to join Slovakia in opposing any agreements by the WHO, the International Health Regulations, the United Nations, or any other groups or agencies that would attempt to usurp national sovereignty and freedoms. And finally, to recognize and acknowledge on the record that the United States and other governments have actively developed biological weapons in violation of the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty, and call upon the United States to investigate and prosecute within the U.S. legal system those responsible for the funding and development of such bioweapons. And I ask that the Slovakian government not only do this, but call upon other nations to do the same. We live in challenging times, and we have an opportunity to make a difference for ourselves, for our nation, and other nations, to stand up for the principles of national sovereignty, while at the same time being willing to help each other out. We have never required the surrender of national sovereignty for nations to work together. In fact, we do so best when we choose to, as opposed to being enslaved by a national totalitarian system.